Conservatives in the Anglo-American democracies embraced international free trade with great enthusiasm. And economists tell us that it contributed to general prosperity in many countries around the world. But there were also a lot of casualties. A lot of people lost jobs. So what do you do about those casualties?
Concepts with Shawn.
All right, welcome. I'm very excited to have Professor Tom Flanagan with us today. He's a sought-after speaker, a best-selling author, and perhaps one of the best-known, if not the best-known, conservative intellectuals in Canada. Welcome, Tom.
Great to be here, Shawn. Finally, I get access to a doctor.
So you're not allowed to make me smile because my problem on anything to do with video is I tend to smile too much. So I have to try to be serious, and we'll edit out those comments I just gave you afterwards. So Professor, you've spent your life, or at least the last 50 years, around politics in Canada. You understand the conservative movement intimately. What does the word conservative mean in Canada?
Shawn, I'm going to have to start with a longer background. You have to understand a few basic things. The terms conservative and liberal don't have any absolute meaning. They are always historically conditioned. In fact, the words conservative and liberal don't begin to be used to describe political thinking until the first half of the 19th century. They're part of a reaction to the French Revolution. Prior to that time, in the English-speaking world, the main descriptors of political positions were Tory and Whig, and those can't really be translated into liberal and conservative. They're versions of an earlier time. The French Revolution was an earthquake in political terms. It overthrew the monarchy. It tried to reform society, root and branch, introducing a new system of weights and measures, the metric system, a new calendar, a new legal system, the Code Civil, so on. And so that really polarized political opinion, not just in France, but outside of France as well. The word conservative was adopted to refer to people that were to the French Revolution and its reforms. And the word liberal came to mean those that had a more sympathetic view of it. The older words conservative and Whig disappeared altogether, but they got absorbed into this new vocabulary. There's a lot of retrospective analysis that takes place in the writing about political philosophy. So you'll often hear phrases like Lockean liberalism. John Locke never called himself a liberal. People didn't think of liberal as a political term. A liberal was a generous person, a liberal giver. And Burke is called a conservative, even though Burke didn't call himself a conservative. He thought of himself as a certain type of Whig. So anyway, there's a lot of anachronistic interpretation that takes place. But the terms liberal and conservative arise in the first half of the 19th century. And that's when representative government starts to get a foothold in Canada. Prior to that time, government in Canada was pretty much colonial government, carried out by appointed governors, appointed by the British Crown. And there were no really significant representative institutions. But let's say by 1850, representative government begins to be practiced. And with that comes party politics. And so by that time, the words conservative and liberal had become common. In the United States, conservative and liberal didn't really take hold as liberal terms. And I would say until probably after 1950. The original split was between Whigs and on the one side and Democratic Republicans on the other. And gradually the Whigs disappeared, and then Democrat and Republicans were adopted by different factions. But we follow British practice and adopted the terms liberal and conservative. So from the second half of the 19th century onward, those are the terms in Canada, but with a rather different meaning. The main issues were not what they are today. Nobody'd ever heard of social issues. Let's say under Sir John A. Macdonald, who had a very long run as leader, the Conservatives thought of themselves as more attached to British institutions than the Liberals. They wanted to be British in North America. They were more skeptical about free trade than the Liberals. And then in specifically Canadian terms, the Conservatives were allied with the Ultramontanes in Quebec, the more dogmatic version of the Roman Catholic Church. So those were the main issues for a long time, really for 100 years, up until up through the government of Lester Pearson. You could define liberalism and conservatism in those terms. The Liberals were more the party of free trade. The Conservatives were more the party of reverence for the past in the form of British institution. But these were mainly party labels. They weren't philosophical terms very much in Canada. You didn't have writers in Canada writing about the meaning of liberalism and conservatism, or if they did, they were talking about the positions taken by the parties, not by the philosophical positions articulated by analysts. Anyway, after 1950, you start to get a kind of an evolution in the terms. The terms liberal and conservative become much more widely used in the United States than they had been. And they come to take on different meaning, which has somewhat of a spillover into Canada. I'm thinking of the book Barry Goldwater, The Conscience of a Conservative, which I think appeared while I was in university.
64 or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. This was perhaps the first time that the term conservative was launched into, as far as I can remember anyway, in widespread public debate. Now, it didn't take hold at first. Goldwater was defeated in the 1964 election, but it did take hold more slowly. It really becomes prominent with the election of Ronald Reagan. And conservatism, for people of our generation, you and I, is really defined, in North America, is really defined by Ronald Reagan, and in the United Kingdom by Margaret Thatcher, and to a somewhat lesser extent in Canada by Brian Mulroney. What this is, in ideological terms, is a fusion of a reverence for tradition regarding the past as a source of wisdom, combined with emphasis on freedom of the individual and free market economics. Now, these latter things, freedom of the individual and free market economics, aren't really conservative ideas. Sir John A. Macdonald did enact a tariff, for example, and the conservatives in general were very suspicious about free trade in Canada. With Reagan, you get a popularization of a fusion which was already taking place between certain parts of the liberal tradition of freedom of the individual and freedom in economics. So positions taken by, in this era of the 1980s, in Britain and the United States, and to a degree in Canada as well, to a large extent, things that you might call classical liberal ideas such as free trade, privatization of government-owned businesses and industries, deregulation, the economy, lower taxes, smaller size of government. These were the things that conservatives talked about. They didn't always do it when they were in power. They didn't enact all of these things, but that's what they talked about. And they did enact a lot of it. For example, in Canada, carried out actually quite a sweeping program of privatization of government businesses. Air Canada, Petro-Canada, but there must have been a couple of dozen of them. Deregulation in the sense of getting rid of Trudeau's national energy program was another conservative initiative at the time. For a generation or two, conservatism was defined as a marriage of theories of individual freedom, free market economics, and some degree of concern for the heritage of the past, patriotism, respect for our governmental heritage from Great Britain, and so forth. But that's not a definition of conservatism as such over the centuries. People prior to this period, like in the United States, to jump around a bit, thinkers who are now thought of as important part of the conservative tradition in the United States, like Alexander Hamilton, was what we would call today a national conservative. He favored protective tariffs, at least for what are called infant industries, to get new industries off the ground. He favored a national bank so that the federal government could have control over this money in banking. He, in general, He was one of the main figures in the Whig Party in the United States. And the Whig Party wanted to create an American government based as closely as possible upon British government, except without a hereditary aristocracy and a hereditary monarchy. So they thought of the president as an elected king. So they wanted a strong executive. They saw the Senate as a kind of a moderating influence upon the representative government. Nobody was really talking about democracy then. So anyway, the original conservatives in all these three Anglo-American democracies, United Kingdom, United States, and Great Britain, would probably be better described as, in today's jargon, as national conservatives. They weren't particularly concerned with free trade at all. They supported the rights of property, to be sure, but they weren't imbued with free market theory. They often favored tariffs and other restrictive measures. They wanted the rights of an upper class in politics, which they saw as a balance against. And in Canada, they were allied with a very backward-looking version of Roman Catholicism, which favored the doctrine of papal infallibility. Ever since the French Revolution, we've had broadly speaking, two politically competing blocs, liberals and conservatives. And of course, it gets more complicated with the rise of socialism later on. But leave the socialists aside for a minute. You have competition between liberals and conservatives. They call themselves liberals and conservatives. But what they're fighting about is quite different at different times. And there isn't, at least I can't see any really strong logic to the positions that they take. It's often driven by political expediency. Conservatism becomes what you want to do when you get back into power after you can drive out the liberals. And liberalism becomes what you want to do after you can drive out the conservatives. And so there's a tremendous amount of political expediency, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Politics is all about forming winning coalitions so you can get control of the government and reward your friends and punish your enemies, if I might put it in a crass way. So there is no really coherent philosophy on either side. So now that's a very long introduction to the question that you asked. So you asked, what is conservatism today in Canada? What I would say is that we are coming out of a couple of generations of this marriage of traditional conservatism with free market economics, which worked fine in the Reagan period and quite a long time afterwards. I can remember Stephen Harper saying before he got into power, he said what he would like to do. This wasn't a public statement, but I don't think. But what I remember him saying somewhere that he wanted to reproduce the Reagan-Thatcher phenomenon in Canada because he thought that Mulroney hadn't been going enough. He thought Mulroney was a kind of, and so he wanted to produce what he saw as a more version of the Reagan-Thatcher period in Canada. And I guess he did, more or less. But anyway, all good things come to an end. And where we are now in our three Anglo-American democracies is a certain degree of disillusionment with free market economics, and particularly with free trade. In the United States, both Biden and Trump, now Trump more spectacularly, but Biden increased tariffs and brought in impediments to free trade in many areas. Trump is doing more of it. So you get disillusioned with free trade. Trump, in particular, criticized the loss of jobs, offshoring of manufacturing and things like that, promising to bring jobs back through tariffs. This might be a traditional conservative idea. It's certainly not a free market idea. And Pierre Poilievre is much the same as far as I could tell, although he's been rather cautious about his beliefs, because in Canadian politics, when you're in opposition, you can't afford to give your opponents too many targets. So opposition leaders tend to be a bit cautious about revealing what they would really like to do. But as far as I can figure out what he believes, it's at least somewhat along the same line. And a lot of people today are using the term national conservative to designate this new type of conservatism, which has divorced itself free market economics. Now, a big part of this, too, issues which didn't even exist in an earlier age, the so-called social issues. They weren't part of conservative thinking very much in an earlier age because nobody was making political issues out of them. But today, with the woke or progressive emphasis on things like gender identity, the rights of gays, and before that, the rights of women, and so forth, these have become pretty central to the split between conservatives and liberals today. And so conservatives tend to be more cautious about these things, although they also often tend to integrate them into their thinking if they lose the original battle. So conservatives today typically defend the equality of women. They equal rights for gays, for example. So the frontier of division today is over gender identity, but not over the rights of gays as such. Anyway, so that's a start towards answering the question. 20 minutes later, I just started it. I'm not usually so long-winded, but the question seems simple, but it's a very complicated one.
Actually, I am thrilled that you took 20 minutes because it's not a 2-minute answer. And I just wanted to leverage off a couple comments that you made. Number one, you said it's not really very philosophical, the division. And then you said their positions seem to change at times, and there's not a whole lot of logic behind their positions. Is it a wasted effort to try to peg down a theoretical or an ideas-based difference between conservatives and liberals? I think they're different going back to the Whigs and around the French Revolution, but to your point, they often seem to blend into the 20th century. But have we run out of runway on that blending? It seems like there's an opportunity now to maybe say, in a positive sense, here are some of the ideas behind a new conservatism, to use your term. Have you thought about that at all, or is that a wasted effort?
Well, no, it's not a wasted effort. As long as we recognize that there aren't two absolute systems of thought, liberalism and conservatism, which are always the same. These are always relative terms. They've emerged as of political controversy in the real world of politics. And then philosophers and academics try to make sense out of them, but we're always playing catch up. So sure, it's a worthwhile enterprise to look for some consistency, but recognizing that you can't expect to find perfect consistency in the thinking of politicians. And so it's always a moving target. Now, what does that mean for today? Conservatives in the Anglo-American democracies embraced international free trade with great enthusiasm. And we had free trade agreements, and not just among ourselves, but with many other countries as well. And economists tell us that it contributed to general prosperity in many countries around the world. But there were also a lot of casualties. A lot of people lost jobs because in an era of free trade, it was cheaper to offshore production and to buy offshore. So what do you do about those casualties? There was the glib prescription that manufacturing workers who had lost their jobs should learn to code. That's maybe will work for a few, but that's not going to work for most. There's a real world problem there. And politicians are going to pick up on it. And Donald Trump picked up on it, has picked up on it to great effect. And he's established himself as a kind of a tribune of people that used to work in manufacturing sectors or even resource industries and have lost their jobs or feel their jobs are threatened. Now, it's not clear that in his first 4 years, it's not clear that Trump was able to reverse the trend here, but at least he made these people feel that he cared about them. It's natural for conservatives today to try and feel some compassion for the casualties of free trade and feel some responsibility for their lot. And that could mean that they will use government as an agent to try and steer the economy to introduce new industries. It may not be successful, but you may see them try. Now, you just Doug Ford as an example. In your province, his enthusiasm for electric vehicles and the batteries in particular, frankly, I think it's a very bad idea, which is going to be extremely expensive for Ontario taxpayers maybe Canadian taxpayers in general, but certainly for Ontario taxpayers. But I understand what he was trying to do. He was trying to introduce a new form, a new manufacturing industry to bring in jobs and opportunities. You're naturally going to expect politicians to advocate some governmental tampering, shall I call it that, with the economy. And Doug Ford is an egregious example with his enthusiasm for electric vehicles. Anyway, so that's one of the issues, is the casualties. The social dimension is a huge issue in contemporary politics. Reacting to the rise of progressivism, there was an earlier form of progressivism 100 years ago, but contemporary progressivism is focused on some different issues. And I think that contemporary progressives have gone way too far in the sense that they've gone beyond the median voter in public opinion. I'm not going to say absolutely what's right or wrong, but politically, they've gotten too far from the median voter, and conservatives have seized the opportunity to lead a reaction against what they usually call woke ideology today.
Do you think this is a natural outcome of the ideas that we usually associate with liberalism? And again, to your point, it's very hard to pin down, and it changes depending on the decade. But I'm thinking of Francis Fukuyama. I like reading his stuff. However, I feel like a lot of the ideas he promotes, so individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, ameliorism, improving government, they seem to apply to a post-war era that has run out of steam a little bit. And now, to your point, with these social issues and the kind of glib attitude, I like that word you used, glib, just go learn to code. You're going to lose your manufacturing job, but you can learn how to code a computer. It seems the liberalism that seemed to work well in the post-war era now is searching around for guardrails to say, wait a second, no, we don't want men in women's bathrooms and some of these other social issues that are coming up. I don't want to go into the social issues. I just want to understand, have we run out of ideas? Are we needing guardrails again? Is there an opportunity now in the conservative movement to come up with some more ideas about promoting the idea that getting a good job is a good thing, even if it means a little bit of government intervention? Now, I personally hate government intervention of any kind. I love Hayek. I love his knowledge problem. Coming from healthcare, there's way too much government involvement. But I worry that maybe we're being glib by saying, yeah, just learn to code, or we want to maximize freedom. If you want to change whatever you want about your body, including your gender appearance, has it gone too far, or have we run out of steam on that side of things?
Let's go back to Hayek for a minute. I think the single most important idea in contemporary political theory is Hayek's theory of spontaneous order, of how society arises as a self-organizing out of individual initiatives, and it can't be directed from the top down. That's an idea that underpins a lot of so-called conservative opposition to governmental regulation. But Hayek did not consider himself a conservative. He, as you may know, he wrote an essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. And he gave that, it was the final chapter of his great book, and the title is now going to escape my mind.
Was it The Road to Serfdom or
No,
Constitution of Liberty?
Constitution of Liberty, yeah. Which in fact is the first book of Hayek's that I ever read. Most people start with The Road to Serfdom, but I started with the Constitution of Liberty. But anyway, Hayek didn't think of himself as a conservative. And he thought of the principle of spontaneous order as underlying liberalism. And he, to the extent that he was involved in influencing public opinion and not just writing books, but he also organized discussion groups like the Mont Pelerin Society. What he thought he was trying to do was to revivify the tradition of classical liberalism, which he thought had been largely erased by an interloper, another body of thought calling itself liberal but not really liberal, which was predicated on widespread social reform and economic reform and government directed by government. And so he thought what was needed was a revival of classical liberalism, which he identified with various thinkers of mostly of the 19th century, with earlier important trailbreakers like Adam Smith and David Hume in the 18th century. So that's how he saw himself, not as a conservative. And what we're calling conservative in the Anglo-American world is often, in the rest of the world, continental Europe, is often called neoliberalism, just to make things more complicated. In Canada and the United States, that term neoliberal is only used by socialists who want to lump liberals and conservatives together as their opponents, and so they call them all neoliberals. There may be something to that. So it's extremely hard to, as I say, to get anything consistent out of this. Personally, I think that there are fundamental principles of government which need to be preserved. I'm not sure whether I would call these principles liberal or conservative. Private property, limited government, the rule of law, representative government. I wouldn't include democracy as such, but representative government, freedom of the individual. I think these are the basic principles of a social order which produces both prosperity, cultural flowering, and freedom of individuals to pursue their own good in their own way. Is that conservative or liberal? I don't know. So I think that we, in a group like Civitas, to which we both belong, but in a wider sense, I think it's important to try and establish the principles of social and political order and to defend them. But it's not really that important to try and label these as conservative or liberal. Bill Gardner, who was the founder of Civitas, he tried to bridge that gap when he talked about Civitas is devoted to ordered liberty, is meant to embrace both liberal and conservative. I mean, that's where I am personally. I'm a great devotee of Hayek, who said he was not a conservative. I'm also a fan, a devotee of other writers who may call themselves conservative. So I'm not hung up on labels, but I am very keen on finding the principles by which society and government, well, government should be organized. Society isn't really organized. Society is self-organizing, so you'd be careful there. But the way in which society is constituted.
I'm glad that you find definitions frustrating. I do also. I was just listening to a lecture by Don Livingston. He wrote the review of Hume's thinking, I think Melancholy and Delirium, and it was one of Bill Gardner's favorite books. He says, Shawn, you have to read this. And anyways, Livingston said, the famous jazz musician, was asked, what is jazz? And he said, well, if I have to give you a definition, he said, you obviously don't know what it is. Having said that, I agree with your principles approach. I think it's brilliant. I also love Hayek. I love von Mises. I'm just wondering, it's like I'm asking you to read my mind now, right? The things I'm thinking of are things, for example, like givens. Karl Marx famously said, you can't accept anything as a given. If you do, you're unfree. And that includes your own human nature. And so right now, it seems like we're having a debate in public about givens. Are you born, grow up, reproduce, and enjoy a career and enjoy your grandkids? Or can you completely redesign that? The idea of our nature as being a given, or the idea of limits to our nature. It seems like on the conservative side of the ledger, there's more comfort with those ideas. However, we seem to say that it's only the economic side of things that defines us now. And I'll just end with this. I was just reading Samuel Johnson. I read him on the weekend. And this was from 17, and he gave a number of quotes about economics. And he was having a debate with Boswell about the price of food, beef versus corn. He sounded like Adam Smith. And Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations didn't come out till 1776. I think along the lines of Hayek and Adam Smith and a lot of these people we would call liberal thinkers, we find those ideas in some of these pretty hardcore conservative types from the 18th century. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether today there's an opportunity to start talking about human nature has limits. Reason has limits, right? Hayek was a big one on that. Hume was also a big one on that. He didn't trust reason. Reason is always and everywhere a slave of the passions. Because it feels to me, maybe I'm reading too much of the post-liberalism type books, but they make some sense where they say it seems like liberalism has gone too far. It ends up giving us glib answers. Do you think there's an opportunity for us to put a bit more meat on the bones of what a new kind of conservatism might promote in the Canadian context?
Yes, I do. And let's talk about the gender issue, since you're a doctor and a biologist, and necessarily. Human beings are a dimorphic species, and we come in two varieties, male and female, and occasionally there are genetic errors which can produce somebody that doesn't quite fit. But some of the species is fundamental to the social order. The social order could take different forms at different times. So now nobody prior to the last 25 years ever thought to question that. So it wasn't an article of debate between liberals and conservatives. There were, you might call them Promethean thinkers like Marx, who saw no intrinsic limits to human nature, but that was confined to even all of socialism, to a fringe of socialism, really. Somehow it has come to the surface today and become a major issue. And so I think we have to reaffirm human dimorphism as a constitutive principle of society and formulate public policies that recognize that and deal with that. So that's an example of a new issue arising, which wasn't previously a point of difference between liberals and conservatives, but it has become one just because human beings tend to divide whenever anything comes up. That's another fundamental principle of human nature, is that we are political creatures and we contest for power and we want to form coalitions for the advantage of members of the coalition. And so an issue arises and it's natural for opinion to divide because it's an opportunity to gain power. So that will happen too. So there's lots to talk about in terms of fundamental principles. Another fundamental principle is, you're talking about Johnson and Boswell, the market. The market, it's like a law of gravitation. In California, politicians will feel good by claiming that they're outlawing gouging in the wake of the fire. But what they're doing is making it harder to adjust to the fires. If you can't raise your price for renting out premises, fewer people will bother to do it. And that's not a liberal or a conservative. Fundamentally, that's an observation about human nature. So that's where I think we should be going, is a flow out of human nature. And those will give us very broad guidelines, not just for the Anglo-American democracies, but for all political systems. Now, having said that, there's still tremendous room for variation. But a system which tries to flout those basic rules will fail. It won't succeed. It can only be propped up then with excessive force. So I think there's lots to discuss and lots to recover, but it's not necessarily liberal or conservative, although it may seem that way in the heat of political contest. So we live in, as members of Civitas, for example, most of us are interested in politics, and we want to play that game, but at the same time, we consider ourselves thinkers, and we want to transcend competitive politics. And Hayek, to go back to Hayek, he refused to get involved in competitive. He certainly had offers to become an advisor, but he said his time was better spent trying to recapture the basic principles of political order. But most of us are trying to live in both worlds simultaneously. So anyway, it's no surprise then that we get confused about terminology, because we have this terminology of political contestation, like liberal and conservative and socialist, but then we often try and apply that terminology to finding fundamental truths about government and politics. But those ideological terms, which were born at a certain time in the 19th century out of certain conditions, those ideological terms don't always fit very well with what we're trying to do as intellectuals. So that was one of the things that Bill Gardner, to go back to that, in the Constitution of Civitas, in the early years, he tried to invite people from different points of view to come in. And we've gotten away from that. We've become more of a conservative cheering section. But Bill, he would go out of his way to invite separatists to speak, and socialists and liberals. I did that too when I was president. I think we've gotten away from that, but it would be good for us to bring in people who have or who think they have major differences, see what those differences are.
I agree. I want to ask you one last question. what holds us together as a country. So Justin Trudeau famously said to the New York Times in 2015 that all that binds us together is our values, and Canada is the first post-national state. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that and what binds us together now, or what could hold us together in the future. Can we make a home together, or is Canada essentially just a hotel where most of us come and go?
I have to give you a hard-boiled political scientist's answer. What holds us together as a polity is fear of other polities. Human beings contest for power within a small that we might sometimes call a nation today. But these entities then contest with other entities for power. And so you have to, particularly small entities have to get big friends. And so we tend to form international coalitions if we're not big enough to go it alone. And I don't know if anybody's big enough to go it alone in the modern world. Maybe the Roman Empire could go it alone for a few hundred years, but today there are many centers of power around the world. So even the United States needs allies, as do the Russians and the Chinese. Yeah, Canada was founded by people fleeing the United States at the time of the American Revolution. Prior to that, we were just British colonies, mainly in existence because of the fur trade acquired from the French, some of it in a fit of absent-mindedness almost. Yeah, there was no raison d'etre for Canada until the Loyalists streamed across the border, and they wanted to be British in North America. And that finally gave rise to the concept of the British North America Act. So the foundation of Canada is political. It's not being American. And that's something that Mr. Trump doesn't understand, and most Americans wouldn't. You really have to be Canadian, or live here anyway, and study Canada to understand that. So the papers this morning are full of, or papers, that's an archaic word, the online news is full of reports about patriotism spiking 10 points or more in recent polls because of the various things that Trump has said. See, what Trump has said, first of all, the tariff issue, and then secondly, his comments about integrating Canada into the United States, these strike very deeply into the Canadian psyche, even for people who've never thought much about it before. But suddenly, when they hear about being absorbed by the United States, that causes them to reflect on what they are as Canadians. And the answer is, Canadians are people in North America who do not want to be American in the sense of part of the United States. They don't necessarily want to be hostile to the United States. They would like to have a profitable friendship with the United States, but they don't want to be part of the United States. That's the fundamental part of Canadian identity. Whether you're talking about French Canadians or English Canadians, what brings everybody together is that they don't want to be Americans. Or even somebody like myself who's born in the United States and still has dual citizenship, but I've chosen to live in Canada and I don't want to be American. I could live with it, but that's not what I want. I'm not hostile to the United States, but I like it here. So your question is there something that holds us together? Yeah, it's political identity, but the political identity is basically founded on fear of the other, fear of being absorbed by the United States. For us, now you go around the world, it will be, for the Japanese, it's probably fear of the Chinese. I mean, it's going to be different in different parts of the world, but it's always a desire to defend yourself against from some potentially hostile power or coalition of powers out there.
I love that political science answer.
It's all from the chimpanzees. The greatest book ever written in the modern era on politics is called Chimpanzee Politics, and that's my guide to human politics.
Oh, good. I'll put that in the show notes for sure. So just to be provocative a bit, and I don't hold this position, but this is something that I'm struggling with. So I think of Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, or the move for internationalism. And we're in this brotherhood of man, and we're all part of the human experience. I agree with you. We are bound together by fear or chimpanzee politics or whatever term we put to it. What answer or what response would you give to the open society folks and the folks who are saying, oh, come on, Professor, you're just being too bellicose and we're all brothers in arms here?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a fundamental point of debate. One of the things that we really do need to debate. I will take the standpoint of national interest, and I will argue that the open society can only exist within a protective cocoon, so to speak, finished by a government that's able to defend a society from external intrusion. So within that government, yeah, we can have all these luxuries of freedom of speech and competition with each other, limited competition with each other, and the rule of law and so forth. Outside that cocoon, it's pretty much of a jungle. And I think Donald Trump is actually a far better guide to international politics. Karl Popper, even though Karl Popper was certainly a much greater thinker than Donald Trump. But as far as international politics goes, it's a jungle, and the ruling principle is force. And ironically, you could reduce the level of violence by applying or threatening to apply overwhelming force. So if you want peace, prepare for war, as the old adage goes. But you can't entrust your fate to others. You can only protect yourself or as part of a broader coalition of like-minded nations. Politics within the state is similar to politics internationally in that they're both involve a quest for power, but they're also different because within the settled order of a state, you can have the luxuries of the open society. Whereas internationally, which is a contest of armed, potentially bellicose powers facing each other, there's nobody in charge. There's nobody able to enforce the rules-based order. You can try and negotiate something through treaties, but it ultimately rests on a balance of force. And I think that whatever defects Trump may have, he does understand that. And so he wants to rebuild the United States force, economic and political force in the world. He's not overly impressed with the so-called rules-based order. So there you go.
Brilliant. We're getting down to the hour here now, so I'm wanting to wrap up. What final comment would you make in all of this? Is there anything that you wished I would have asked you that I didn't?
You might have asked me, why am I a conservative, even though I've thrown a lot of shade on the labels. I've seen myself at other points in my life as under different labels, but I've come to see myself as a conservative because in the world as it is, the people who are most likely to uphold what I see as eternal principles of human order call themselves conservatives. And so that's where my friends are. That's where my like-minded people are. Maybe we could call ourselves something else. I'm not hung up on the name, but that's just my observation, that if I want to find people with whom I fundamentally agree, I'm most likely to find them among political parties or other groupings that think of themselves as conservative. And I don't want to be dogmatic about it. I try and resist dogmatic definitions of conservatism as absolute terms. Some conservatives, unfortunately, want to cast out heretics, which I don't think is right. But anyway, that's where I see people with whom I agree about eternal principles eternal in the sense that these principles of human order grow out of human nature, which we could discuss in another, what does it mean to have an evolutionary nature? I think human nature is a reality, even if it does change slowly over time. And it gives rise to principles of order. And I think people who call themselves conservatives are more likely to understand these today. Maybe in the 19th century it might have been different, but right now I think that's where I find people who have a more principled understanding of human order. So why?
Brilliant. I can't thank you enough. I wish I would pin you down for 2 or 3 hours, but I really appreciate the hour that you've given.